Hello everybody and welcome back to INTR 101. So first off, I want to apologize for the weird lighting behind me. I'm currently filming from home and not my office. Okay, we're going to dive into some study tips for today's lecture. Now, oftentimes when I was studying as an undergrad, I would sit down to get ready and I realized that I had no idea what I was doing. I felt much like this meme. So what we're going to talk about today is some different ways to really study effectively, to study actively, and to hopefully make your studying a much more efficient and quality experience for you. With that, let's dive in. So I want you to think about when and how you start preparing for an exam. I know I've run into a lot of students who have said things like, oh, I start preparing 3 days beforehand. They live by the 3-day rule. And maybe that works for some classes, but it's not going to work for all classes. Studying needs to be kind of consistent and happen well enough in advance that you have time to really synthesize and understand that information. So studying should start early, right? You want to build and stick to a study schedule. You want to action plan your study plan, and you really, really want to avoid cramming. Now, sometimes it's not always possible, and I fully understand that. If you forgot that a test was coming up, or you have a lot of tests all in one week, it might be hard to kind of not wait until the last minute to study. But hopefully you can set yourself up through your note-taking, your critical reading, your time management to make sure that when you sit down to study, it's happening early enough and it's really productive for you. So first we want to find the time and the place to study. So look for time in your schedule that you could stick in some study blocks. You know, we built those schedules for ourselves, now let's utilize them. And when you're looking for a time to study, something else that you want to consider is when do you do your best studying, right? For me, I know that like 9:30 to 11:30 is like my most productive time of the day. So if I have a really big task, I try and stick it at that time of the day because I know it'll be easier to do. Maybe you study really well in the afternoon, or you study well kind of in the evening. Making sure that you place that time where it works best for you is really helpful. And then you want to consider how long you should be studying for at a time. Now, I kind of talked about this back in time management, but 1 to 1.5 hours is a good time to aim for. It's enough time to actually get some stuff done, but it also isn't too long where you're going to kind of burn out afterwards. If you're with a study group, it might be easier to study for a longer period of time because you're kind of going off of that group energy, and that can be really helpful. But make sure that in between your big study blocks, you take a little bit of a break. So even if you block out 4 hours to study by yourself, take a 5 to 10 minute break every hour. Now, let's consider where some good places to study might be. And while we're all taking online classes, it's really important to find a space for yourself that you can dedicate to studying. So as I mentioned before, trying to avoid your bed because that isn't always the greatest idea. Bed is for sleeping. It might be kind of hard to separate those feelings as you're trying to study. And then most importantly, minimize distractions. So turn off the background Netflix, put on some just like chill, low vibes music, and study with that, right? You want to make sure that you're focusing on the material, not necessarily every single thing that's happening around you. So I have another example schedule here, and you'll notice that this person put some study blocks in. They're around an hour to an hour and a half. Some of them are a little bit longer, but hopefully this person is taking some breaks in between. But something else that's really key to notice is that this person included both the drop-in tutoring times for their classes and the SI pass times for their classes. And utilizing those campus resources is a really great way to maximize the effectiveness of your studying. So if you go to tutoring, you can get your questions answered really quick, and you can have some insight from someone who's been successful in the class. SI Pass is all about peer-assisted study sessions, right? Our SI Pass leaders build these really fantastic study plans for each session that'll help you really dive into the material. And both tutoring and SI Pass are happening all throughout the semester. So you can go at any point and really start to build that knowledge of the material rather than waiting until just a day before the exam to try and cram for it. So we've figured out where we're going to study and when we're going to study. Why don't we just start studying, right? Like, what's stopping us from actually doing our studying? And the answer is procrastination. And this is something that a lot of you brought up in your goal setting comments and reflection is it's really hard to find the motivation to start studying. Right now, this semester, like every single student I've talked to has talked about the struggle with motivation. And it's much easier to kind of put our things off if we can't find the desire or the drive to do them. And it's a real problem. I know I suffer from that in my own job and in my own life. So how do we kind of fight past that procrastination? And one way to do that is to make sure that everything that we're doing in class and before a test helps us get prepared for it. So one way to avoid procrastination is to realize that studying starts in class. So you want to make sure that you're using that time efficiently. You know, we talked about this in note taking. You want to arrive to class early and prepared, and you want to look for instructor hints. And this is some active studying that occurs while you're learning the material. You know, and you want to use those resources, things like the think tank or the writing center, tutoring, SI Pass. Those can all help kind of get the motivation going for these things, right? If you have something blocked out in your schedule where you want to attend an SI Pass session for your class, it's going to give you that little push to go. And they've done all of the hard work for you. You just need to show up and be engaged and really like involved in that study session. So that can help remind you of your motivation, and it can help you push past your procrastination. The other thing that's really helpful is make sure that you're organized. You know, arrive to your study space and breathe. Bring your books, your tools, your notes, your pencils, anything you might need. You want to set yourself up for success. And if you have all of the materials around you, it's a lot easier to do. Again, minimize distractions. It's really easy to procrastinate on a big project if we have a lot of different things that we can put our time and energy to instead. One other really key thing is to identify the goal of your work session. So, you know, we talk about this in goal setting, we talk about it in time management, but setting a clear and specific goal to achieve during your studying helps give you some direction and motivation. So if you just sit down and say, I'm going to study Chem 111, that's awesome, that's great. But what are you going to study? How are you going to study? And at what point do you know when you're going to be done studying? And all of those questions and kind of that vagueness makes it really hard to get started, to find the motivation, and to find the drive to do it. So what you can do is create an action plan for your study plan. Now, we talked about this in time management, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more today, just to really kind of hammer out those details. So we're going to action plan our study plan. And all you're going to do is figure out a class that you have right now and just come up with at least 3 steps for how you're going to study for it. So, you know, for this person, they're going to find some text resources. They're going to skim the first and last chapters of those text resources, and they're going to take notes on one chapter. So what's really great about this study plan is that it's very clear, right? So they have some things that they can check off as they complete them, right? As soon as you find 2 text sources, great, done. As soon as you skim the first and last chapters, you can check that off. And as soon as you've taken notes on at least 1 chapter of the material, you can check it off. So giving yourself these small goals as you go is going to really help you get through a really giant study plan that you have. And I encourage you all to include at least 1 resource to help you while you're studying. And whether that's something like tutoring or something like a friend or a really great internet resource that you found, you know, put those things into your study plan so you have something to rely on when things get more challenging. And then consider what some roadblocks might be. So those can be things in the material themselves, like Maybe you recognize that the most recent chapter in your poli-sci class is really difficult. That might be a roadblock for you. Or maybe it's something about your physical space. You realize like, hey, I'm gonna get distracted when my roommates come home. So how do I set myself up to kind of work through that distraction and work through that roadblock? Now, a quick reminder about the Pomodoro technique, but it's really, really useful during studying. And you can do this with friends to kind of keep yourself accountable. So even if you're all studying different material, sit in the same room and set a timer for 25 minutes. All of you can study really hard on whatever the thing is that you're working on, and then take a 5-minute break to chat, to scroll Instagram, to talk about something, to share aspects of what you're doing, and then jump back into studying and going back and forth. So that does a couple of things. One, it helps build some community around a task that maybe isn't super enjoyable. And two, it helps hold you accountable for your studying. So having some friends who also have a shared goal of doing well in a class can be really useful in the long run for your shared success in your academics. So let's talk about a few other ways to get started. One thing that I recommend is look for an easy way to enter your work. So this might be something like rewriting your notes, returning to material that you feel confident in, maybe identifying some steps and problems that you've worked on. So oftentimes when you have like a really big task to complete, it's hard to find these ways to get started. So go easy on yourself, make sure you're finding something that's going to get you kind of ready and in the mindset of studying. And then try working for only 10 minutes. Yes, maybe you set aside 4 hours to study for a test, but just hold yourself accountable for the first 10 minutes. And that's a lot more doable than that huge block of time that you originally set aside. And you can slowly build up to how much time you're studying. So maybe you study for 10 minutes, take a quick break, and then you study for 20 minutes, and then you take a quick break, and then you study for 30. And by the end of the time, you've studied for the majority of the 4 hours that you set aside, but you did it in a way that wasn't super difficult and didn't make you feel burnt out at the end of it. So one other thing to keep in mind, and this is helpful since we talked about our notes last week, your notes are a study tool and they should be helpful to you. So go back through and review and revise those notes. This is an option to do for one of the deliverables, and it's something that's a really great way to study. So if we're talking about studying early and often, revisiting your notes after class is a great way to build that habit. And when you're revisiting them, you can summarize your key points, fill in any gaps, and then, kind of build out the info that you're learning. And then when you get ready to go into class the next day, quickly review your notes beforehand. Skim over what the major points were so that you're in the mindset to really focus and learn in class that day. And then rewriting your notes can help you solidify concepts. So if you think back to the different note-taking techniques that we discussed, maybe you're taking your notes in class in sort of an outline form. One way to help you study would be develop a giant chart over all of the key points, ideas, people, and things like that to help you see that information in a new way and really solidify it in your brain. So I mentioned writing some steps to your problems, and this is a really great technique to study for any STEM classes. So whenever you have a problem that's usually symbolic, so let's think about this story problem here at the top. The sum of two numbers is 84, and one of them is 12 more than the other. What are the two numbers? Maybe this is a problem that might be on one of your tests. One thing that you can do is start to build some structure for yourself and start to translate your word problems, your numerical problems into plain old simple words that you can understand better. So the way to do this is to, one, identify the goal of your problem. So maybe you have an engineering problem that's all about fluid dynamics. Figure out what it is that they're asking. Then identify the type of problem that it is to kind of help you recall and identify different problems. And as you're solving that problem, write out next to each step in your own words what's going on. And what this does is shifts away from just rote memorization of how to solve problems into a deeper understanding of figuring out what it is that's occurring in each problem that you're solving. So it's a great way to check your understanding, and it helps build this like outline or guide for you when you're then on an exam. And we'll talk more a little bit about like how to do that on an exam in the next lecture. But this is a really fun thing to try. It can be done for like any STEM class, and honestly, it can be done for a lot of other classes too. So maybe you have an essay prompt for, I don't know, like an anthropology class or something. Try and figure out what it is the essay is actually asking, and then identify, you know, how you're going to solve that problem, how you're going to get to the answer that you're hoping for. So I encourage you, just kind of like last week, go through and summarize your notes for yourself. Just try it out really quick. You can pause the video, see if it helps you feel a little more confident in that material. And then I mentioned filling in the gaps. So as you're studying, you may notice that a professor didn't really go in depth on something, but they said it was going to be on the exam. How do you get some of that information? Well, you can attend drop-in tutoring or SI Pass. You can check out the Writing Center if you're in a more composition-based class. The Think Tank has some great tutoring for our engineering courses. And then as always, go to your professor or your TA. You know, you can point to the section in your notes where you're like, you know, we kind of just briefly talked about this, but you mentioned it might be on the exam, and I'm a little unclear about why it's important or some of the details. You know, reaching out to those folks is really helpful, and it really helps you build important academic relationships that could be really beneficial throughout the rest of your academic career. Now, one thing that I like to remind people is that studying needs to be active. So all of the tips we just talked about are really wonderful ways to get started on your studying and to get you in the studying mindset. But sometimes they aren't as like active and engaging. So let's talk about that a little bit. So this is the standard kind of picture of active versus passive learning. So in our passive aspect, it's reading, listening, kind of looking at stuff. So if you were just sitting in class and not really taking a ton of notes, just letting the information kind of wash over you, that's a bit more passive way to learn. It's still good and you still get a lot of information from it, but sometimes that information doesn't stick with you as much as if you were actively engaging with it. So active learning incorporates speaking, saying, and doing the work. So giving a presentation on the material, leading a group discussion on it, actually practicing the problems that you're learning and writing things out. That is all much more active learning and really helps solidify all of the concepts. So let's talk about some ways to do that. One way is to build connections. So we talked about making a concept map in our note-taking lecture. That is a really active way to study. So going through the material that you're covering in your classes and trying to connect each topic to the other ones and kind of building this story about what's going on. And then find a way to make the information stick with you. And there are ways that you can kind of trick your brain, possibly by listening to the same type of music while you study a particular subject, or chewing one flavor of gum while you take practice tests for a particular subject. These are all things that help your brain associate what's going on with a particular like outside influence, I guess. So you can then think about these connections while you're taking the exam. So for me, one connection that I built is that cinnamon rolls always remind me of electrodynamics, because the study group that I studied electrodynamics with, we always made cinnamon rolls when we were studying. So when I would go to take the exam, I'd just think of cinnamon rolls, and some of that would help me remember some of the other topics. Now, this doesn't work for everyone, but it can be a fun and kind of low stress thing to try. Now, the other thing is finding memory devices. So there are some pretty standard ones like acronyms like FOIL, first, outside, inside, last, when you're multiplying binomials in math. So you can come up with an acronym for yourself that really works. There's also acrostics, which are like a catchy sentence or phrase to help you remember something. So King Phil came over for the jeans special. helps you remember the organization structure of kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. There are lots of other ones. So you may have heard SOHCAHTOA for remembering the relationships between angles. Honestly, I could never spell SOHCAHTOA, so mine was some old hippie caught another hippie tripping on acid, and that stuck with me. And to this day, I will still randomly say it and remember those angle relationships. So these memory devices do a couple of things. One, they're snappy and easy to recall when you're taking an exam. But two, it really challenges you to build this tool that's going to help you later. And it's a fun way to connect the material to outside sources. Now, all of your studying is going into your preparation for an exam, as well as building that foundational knowledge for future classes. But if you're really focused on preparing for that exam, the most important thing to remember is that you need to know thy enemy. And what that means is make sure that you understand the exam format. And as you study and prepare for it, practice the questions in a way that follows the exam format. So anticipate the way the material will be presented, whether that's multiple choice, short answer, true or false, anything like that. Make sure you have a good idea of how that exam might look. And then practice solving the exam questions and do so under the conditions that might exist while you're taking it. And what I mean by that is if you know ahead of time that your test is going to be 25 multiple choice questions with a 50-minute time limit, make a practice test that has 25 multiple choice questions and set a timer for 50 minutes. That'll give you a really good idea of how confident you are in the material and how well you're going to be able to get through the exam. And when you're taking these practice exams, do so without your notes. Make sure to put them away if that's a condition for the exam. Because again, that's going to give you a better picture of how well the material is sticking with you and how well you understand it. So make sure you practice your answers. If you have an exam that you know there's going to be a lot of essay questions, practice writing out those essays or practice saying them out loud. If you have an exam where there might be some graphs involved, make sure you're able to recreate those graphs and to understand what's going on in them. If you're solving a lot of different equations, again, kind of build a template for yourself and practice solving problems like it. Make sure that you do something that engages the material in a meaningful way. And then what can also be helpful is to meet with others to come up with sample questions. So oftentimes when we build practice tests for ourselves, we subconsciously give ourselves questions that we know we can answer. And that's great, but it doesn't test us on the material that we're less confident on. So one thing that you can do is you can have a group of friends in the course and maybe each come up with 5 questions. Then send them to or put them all on one document and take a practice test that way. So you have some questions on the material that you're confident in, but you're also seeing some questions that are written by other people in different ways. And this is really going to help to make sure that you understand what's going on and can help you anticipate how questions might be worded differently than what you're used to. And then make sure that you actually correct each other's answers and go through them and understand what's happening in each one. So if one person gets it wrong, but another person thought it was a super easy question, have the person who understood it explain it to the person who doesn't. This helps both people. If the person understanding it gets to explain it, it's another chance for them to dive into it. And the person who doesn't understand it now gets a really nice and concise explanation. And remember that all of this is still possible, even though we're online. You can connect with groups, have a Discord, have anything, and share some questions over email or anything like that. Build this practice exam and take it. And then, I don't know, like have a Google call or a Zoom call to check in to see how the answers were going. So the other thing that's really useful, and you can do this by yourself, with some friends, with your parents, with your partner, whoever, is to give an elevator pitch. So this is a 1 to 2 minute speech on a topic that you're studying, and it's worded in a way that is understandable by anyone. So a person doesn't necessarily have to be in your course to understand what you're saying. And this can serve as a way to really check your understanding of material. And the ability to summarize material in a clear and concise way can help get a sense of how well you actually understand things. So an elevator pitch is what I'm having you do for your studying deliverable. You're going to record yourself giving one and then send it to me. But I want to make sure that you have an example. So I'm going to give an elevator pitch on something that I really love to study and something that I spent a lot of time learning in undergraduate, and that is disease modeling. So keep in mind the time limit that I set for all of y'all is 1 to 2 minutes. This might not be that long because I'm kind of doing it off the cuff, but let's see. An elevator pitch on SIR models. So if we're looking at a disease and we want to know how that disease is going to spread through the population, we can model it with mathematics. And the way that we do that is by taking an ordinary differential equation, which is a type of equation that shows the rate at which something moves through something else. And we're going to take our population, split it into 3 chunks, and then write an equation for each one of those. So we have the population that's susceptible. So those are folks that haven't gotten the disease but could get it. People who are actively infective and can infect others. And then removed. So those are folks that are either have immunity to the disease, have already gotten it and can't get it a second time, or who have passed on. So what we do is we take the folks who are susceptible and we mix them with the infected folks, and this is a mass action term. And then we have a rate at which those folks get infected and move into the infected class. And then we have a constant rate of recovery. So the rate at which folks recover from being sick, and they then go into the removed class. So we can take all of these equations and then solve for things like what is the maximum amount of the population that'll get infected, how long will the infection last, how long will the epidemic last. So those equations in general look like ds dt, so the derivative of s with respect to t, which in this case is time, equals negative s times r times beta. And then we have di dt equals s times I times beta minus I times gamma. And beta is our rate of infection and gamma is our rate of recovery. And then finally we have our removed class, which is dr dt, and that equals positive gamma times I. So you just have all of the folks that are kind of moving into the removed class naturally. A couple of key points. You have a term which is 1 over gamma, which is the number of days or the length of time that someone will be infected. And then you also have something called beta over gamma, which is your R0 value. And your R0 value is sort of how infectious a disease is. And that tells you, like, for every single person that gets infected, how many other folks can they infect? A disease has to have an R0 of at least 1 in order to spread throughout a population, but it could go up really, really high. So something like measles might infect a lot of people. Okay, so that's an example of an elevator pitch. And hopefully you'll notice that it was done in really, really simple terms that any person could understand. So for your assignment, you're going to do that for some topic in your class. Tell me something really cool. I want to learn an awesome fact. Maybe it's about economics, maybe it's about anthropology or political science or mathematics, anything. Just explain a topic that you're learning to me. And this is something that you can do with friends. You can really annoy your roommate if you'd like to, but it's a really fun way to actively engage with your material and challenge you to check your understanding. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of studying, and the other thing that I want to remind you is to breathe. So we talked about this in stress management, how important it is to take some time for yourself. And if you've got a really packed schedule and a lot of exams, there are a couple of things you need to remember. It's okay to say no to things that are going on. So maybe your friends want to have a giant Zoom get together. It's okay to decline if you have some study obligations because you've got an exam coming up. And you can just let them know that. Like, you can say, hey folks, I'm really sorry, I have to study for a test. Could we maybe do this another night, like a celebration after my exam? And then keep in mind that you're human. So even if you do need to restrict the amount of things that you're able to do while studying, remember that it's still important to connect with family or friends, and that you still deserve to treat yourself to a nice meal or Netflix or a long walk or some way to kind of decompress, right? So if we think back to our study schedules, it's really important to include breaks. So remember to take them to kind of help you de-stress, decompress, and make sure that you're not feeling burnt out. When in doubt, practice some of that structured breathing that we talked about during stress management, and make sure to make sleep a priority. So sleep really helps the connections solidify in your brain. So you want to make sure that you get sleep before you take an exam and throughout the time that you're studying for that exam. So a couple of takeaways. There's no time like the present to start. Even if your test is like 3 weeks away, you can start studying now by, making sure that your notes are really up to date, by writing summaries for them, and by actively engaging with some campus resources like tutoring and SIPass. It's all about quality over quantity. Sometimes studying for 8 hours straight right before an exam isn't as useful as studying for like 2 hours a day for a while, just to kind of refresh your memory on that material, right? So you want to make sure that whatever studying you're doing is active and really engages with that material. The passive studying can be helpful too, but to really solidify those concepts, make sure it's active studying. And then practice the way you need to perform. Make sure that the practice tests you're making for yourself really simulate how the exam is actually going to be structured. And then finally, take a break. Make sure that you're taking some time for yourself before an exam, as you're studying, everything like that. So with that, we are going to jump over to BB Learn and look at a few things there. So, oh my gosh, why is it so hard? Okay, there we go. If you head over to the weekly content folder, you will see that week 4 stuff is up. So these videos obviously will be going on, but we've got the slides there, and then we've got the study skills deliverable and the test taking deliverable. So for the study skills deliverable, you're going to record yourself giving an elevator pitch. I gave an example in this lecture. From one topic in your class, and you need to explain the topic thoroughly, but in such a way that someone unfamiliar with the subject would understand. And you can check out, like I said, you can scroll back through this video to see kind of that example of how I did it. But this should be between 1 to 2 minutes in length. And you can record this video on Zoom, on your phone, whatever. Just make sure you submit it here in a format that would be viewable by any computer. If you have any trouble submitting it this way, you can always submit it to me via email as well. So with that, that is all that I have for you on study skills. Obviously, this was really broad. So if you'd like to dive into sort of really personalized ways to apply some study skills tips to the field of study that you're currently in, just send me a quick email. I'd be more than happy to personalize that, to meet with you and kind of work out the details of how best to study for the classes that you're currently in. But with that, I hope you have a great day. Stay warm out there. It looks like it's supposed to snow soon. So have a wonderful time. Bye, everybody.